Despite Boston's recent surge in new housing, there's no shortage of community meetings where developers face opposition. Outside the city, there's an even greater chance of meeting with resistance, most commonly summed up by the phrase, "not in my backyard." To tell us about a new study of the NIMBY phenomenon is a co-author of a new report from the Political Science Department at Boston University. We'd like to welcome Assistant Professor Katherine Levine Einstein. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
First, we've heard about this before, but why is this NIMBY phenomenon so important to get a handle on for this whole region, I guess?
Yeah, so Greater Boston right now is facing a significant housing shortage. We have fewer units available than what people need, and this is really driving up housing prices, right? So both the cost of purchasing a home and the cost of renting a home have gone up astronomically over the last 5 years. And so what we really need to be doing is building more housing to address this crisis. And NIMBYism may be one of the key obstacles to getting enough housing built to meet the needs of people moving to the area.
And of course, the next question that comes into that mix is, what happens if Amazon wants to have a second headquarters here? Where do the people go?
Exactly.
What about the things that feed into NIMBY? We typically think of community meetings and developers presenting plans, but isn't a lot of this about zoning codes that are, not that flexible to begin with?
Well, so what the meetings happen in part because of what the zoning codes sort of permit or don't permit. So basically, if you're a developer and you're proposing a project of a certain size, you sort of bring it forward to the town, and the town might say this requires a special permit or this requires a variance from existing zoning in some ways. And so that typically involves public hearings where members of the public are then offered a chance to provide input on a development. So zoning absolutely matters, but even in sort of places that have fairly progressive and liberal zoning codes, public meetings are required for most projects that are over a certain size.
Well, what about the sample of people who tend to go to these meetings? What are they like?
So they're very deeply unrepresentative of their broader communities. I think the big takeaways is they are much more likely to be white, and they're much more likely to be homeowners than the general community as a whole. They're also really attitudinally unrepresentative. So they're much more likely to be opposed to the construction of new housing. And this is true sort of when we compare the people who attend these meetings to opinions in the general public. We sort of know that these folks are much more opposed to the construction of housing.
What about the reasons they give for opposing developments?
So traffic is really popular. They also bring up the environment and environmental concerns, and they also bring up concerns about density. Those are the most popular.
Now, of course, when I looked at the list of those reasons, there's nothing here about any overt racism or anything like that. So maybe those could be legitimate reasons.
Right. So I think it's really hard to know and sort of to evaluate what's legitimate and what's not. We find cases where people are opposing the construction of 4-unit buildings because of traffic concerns. And I have no doubt that 4 additional cars or 8 additional cars might produce a mild annoyance on some streets, but it's hard to imagine that creating systematic traffic problems. But more generally, I think it's also really hard to adjudicate what is a racist concern and what's not, because I think most people sort of know that at a public meeting, even if you hold sort of racial or class-based fears, you can't really talk about concerns in those terms and be taken seriously by zoning and planning board officials. So we can't really tell in the data whether these are sort of people genuinely concerned about traffic or saying they're concerned about traffic, but they're really concerned about something else, or people who just know that if they say traffic, the developer has to do a traffic study, and that delays the project and costs the developer a significant amount of money.
Is there a way to change the mix of people going to these meetings?
So yes and no. So I think there are ways that towns can do a better job of recruiting a more representative mix. One thing that a lot of Massachusetts towns currently do is they use these things called abutter notices to notify nearby property owners of proposed developments. And so these notices only go out to people who own property or homeowners, and they aren't going out to renters in some places. And so I think it would be really helpful to ensure that sort of everyone who lives near a project is aware of what's going on in their communities, and for cities and towns to make an explicit effort to notify renters. So that said, yes, there are some things cities and towns can do, but I think the nature of housing development is always going to attract more opponents than supporters, just because it has concentrated costs and diffuse benefits. Very few people are going to be motivated to attend a meeting by the really tiny affordability benefit of 3 additional housing units in a city. But if you live next door to that, proposed 3-unit development, the construction noise, the parking hassles, like all of those things are real and understandable concerns that are going to motivate people to show up to oppose a project in a way that it's not going to motivate supporters to show up.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Katherine Levine Einstein from Boston University. You've been to some of these meetings. What's it like? Because I'm sure you've got some people there that they have these skill sets and that they have this jargon. I mean, can't that be intimidating for people?
Absolutely. So I think some people are sort of shockingly expert in these things, right? You'll have people come into these meetings and say, I'm an engineer and I evaluated the developer's traffic study and I think that they did this, this, and this wrong and the town needs to ask for a new traffic study. So we have multiple cases where people bring up their own professional expertise. We have multiple cases where people bring lawyers to these meetings. And we've even been able to identify a few cases where people then go on to file lawsuits about the developments in question after attending these meetings. So these are people who are bringing expertise and willingness to pursue legal challenges to bear to stop unwanted developments.
Of course, another thing that's feeding in here is that there are incentives for new development outside the city, carrots and sticks, of course. Aren't they doing something, at least right now?
Yes, I mean, one of the big ones is Chapter 40B, which when you think about, so basically what that requires is for any town where there's less than 10% affordable housing, if a developer proposes a project that has a certain percentage of affordable housing, they can bypass local zoning rules. And that certainly helps, right? Like we see affordable housing developments happening in places where it probably never would have been permitted by the town government otherwise. But we still see with Chapter 40B developments a huge amount of public opposition, sort of really rancorous public hearings, and we see a lot of legal challenges to these kinds of proposals. And so I think there are definitely sort of state and local options that help to produce more housing in general and more affordable housing specifically, but they still face a lot of the challenges that we identify in our research.
Well, if you look around the country, there's the horror story of how expensive things are in San Francisco. But what about some more encouraging things? Have you seen other places do this better?
I think one of the things that's actually really striking to us is just how generalizable this phenomenon is, unfortunately. So we've done some research in sort of places where you might not expect to find this level of NIMBYism. So one place is Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is a city that by a lot of metrics is sort of economically struggling, much more racially diverse, different governing system than a lot of the places that we looked at in Massachusetts. And we still see in places where housing developments are being proposed, sort of vociferous opposition from the neighbors and specifically unrepresentative people showing up to these meetings.
And again, other kinds of incentives you can bring into play to get other people to go to these meetings.
Yeah. So what can you do to get people to show up? I think one solution that cities might want to look to is moving away from this idea of looking at projects on a sort of specific neighborhood by neighborhood, project by project basis. So try to get more citizen input on city level zoning decisions and city level master plans, rather than trying to get the public to show up to every single one of these meetings. Because I don't think it's necessarily a reasonable expectation to ask pro-housing advocates to go to every single neighborhood meeting about every single project proposal. These meetings can be 2 to 3 hours long. People have to arrange for childcare, maybe time off from work. And so I think that kind of strategy maybe can work in the short term for some projects, but as a longer term strategy, I think we need to be thinking more strategically about where we are soliciting public input and making sure that the points where we're soliciting public input will attract a representative subset.
No, back here in Boston, we have people who say NIMBY, and we also have people who say build it because we need it. But out in the suburbs, where do you find people who say, yeah, build it, we need it?
I would say there's some inner ring suburbs where there's largely more support for more housing. But I think one of the things I want to highlight that we find in our research, there is no city or town in the greater Boston area in our data set where there is majority support for new housing in these public meetings. And this is true for Cambridge, Massachusetts, where only 40% of people who attended these meetings showed up in support of new housing.
Thank you very much for being with me. Before we go, we should mention you've got this report online, so if people want to check it out, what's the best way to find it?
Absolutely. So it's on all of our websites. So you can look at mine, which is my BU website, where we have it available. It's also been featured in the Boston Globe and is forthcoming in a journal called Perspectives on Politics.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Katherine Levine Einstein will have more news in just a moment.